Thank you very much. Good morning to all of you. Chairperson, these people are asleep. Good morning to all of you. You know, I'm an African, we greet. I'm worried also about people still arriving. Should we wait until they're seated? There has to be some transport problem, the reason. Maybe it's power outage, they were stuck in the lift. I want to start on a bit of a somber note to indicate one of the reasons why I'm standing here this morning is in memory of a very dear friend and comrade who was the Secretary to Parliament who passed away earlier this year, Mikey Kutsia. One of the reasons why I didn't need too much persuasion to come here is because Mikey was so involved in the establishment of the organization, and I think it's in his honor that I'm here today as well. I want to indicate, though, that having been a member of the National Assembly for 20 years, I'm a little bit worried about myself now, because things have become so exciting since I've left. I'm told that the discussion for tomorrow amongst the Secretaries chairperson would be how the rest of the legislatures can become like the National Assembly and Gauteng. So I wish you well for those debates. The question that I was asked, and I think the question before the entire seminar, is how to strengthen the legislative sector. And I think that what's very important is that if we want to strengthen, then we need to understand what needs to be strengthened. It can't be an occasion for a conference, maybe that's the reason. But it's very important to understand what needs to be strengthened, failing which we try and fix what is not broken. So parts of my presentation will be somewhat provocative. It's in the nature of who I am to try and provoke some responses and issues that we need to engage with to ensure that we never become comfortable with where we're sitting right now. And I want to go back to look at the mandate of the legislatures, and part of this is of course shaped by the Constitution, and Section 42(2) sets out what we expect of Parliament, and I want to say that if there are lawyers in the House, and there must be lawyers in the House here, they will say it applies mutatis mutandis also to the provincial legislatures. And it's very important that we remind ourselves that in this pomp and ceremony that obtains in Parliament, and this battle about rules and so on, we stop to think about why Parliament exists at all. And I think the Constitution at 42(2) is abundantly clear about providing our people with a voice in democracy and to ensure government by the people. So there's no parliamentarian who represents their own jacket. You must have been elected by some part of this electorate to be able to get there, and then, having gotten there, there are a number of things required, and amongst those issues is not only to represent and to act as that voice of the people, but also, very importantly, the Constitution is clear on this as well, to oversee executive action. Presents an interesting problem for us in the way in which our Constitution is set up, because there are many members of Parliament who hope to move a little bit, sometimes fast, sometimes slowly, but they'd like to get to the front benches. And so if you want to get to the front benches, then you have to toe the line a little bit, and so you don't want to oversee too much. And that presents us with some problem. The strategic plan of the parliamentary system talks about those values of constitutionality, people-centeredness. It brings in Chapter 3 of our Constitution on cooperative government, but also speaks of professionalism and good institutional governance. So whatever else we want to talk about, it's fundamentally important that we remind ourselves that Parliament exists for a very strong purpose, and as the reminders from yesterday's session informed us, that in the context of the separation of powers, we must not slip up on the responsibilities of Parliament in the context of our Constitution, because if we collapse it all, if we collapse that important division between the legislature and the executive, then I think our democracy will be weakened in the process. Now, I didn't know what happened yesterday, and I don't have a crystal ball, and so I hurriedly spoke to Dr. Dostal this morning, and she said that I could put in this slide, but she would amend it in the course of the day. You see, because part of systems thinking is to understand how things connect up, and how an issue in one part of what we normally look at impacts on other issues. How what happens in the education system in society impacts on how we conduct ourselves relative to our neighbors. It will inform our life chances in respect of employment. All of these things are interconnected, and so when we look at the outcomes of a democracy on whether we are responding very importantly to the preamble to our Constitution, the second clause of which says to raise the living standards of all citizens and to free the potential of each person. You can't look at it in a narrow, myopic way. It's all interconnected. And so the approach that we take has always got to be interconnected. So amongst the provocations I will ask is how interconnected Parliament is, but we can get there in a moment. But what's at the very center of what we're talking about when we say we need to recap something about systems thinking is that you need to develop an approach in what we do to solving problems. It's not marching in step. It's not merely following the rules of Parliament. It's about solving a problem. If in South Africa we say we have a problem of youth unemployment, the question is, how do you solve it? Within what time frame? By what measures? How do you solve it? Because it's not good enough to know about the problem. It's not good enough to analyze society and know what is wrong in society. We need to be able to transform society, and that, I think, is the mandate, certainly, of our generation. And that transformation challenge is fundamentally important. And the reason why I think system thinking was brought in yesterday is to ensure that we focus on an approach to problem solving, and I'm sure that Dr. Dostal, whom I'd never met before, would have helped you yesterday at least across the first hurdle in respect of problem solving through system thinking. Now, before I forget, I'm supposed to talk about the National Development Plan. But you see, the NDP is largely based on a systems approach. It's largely based on a systems approach. In the way in which the plan is written, we say because let me just walk you through how we got to the plan. The first thing we did was to analyze what the Constitution requires of us, because that is the mandate. That is what defines what we would consider our common purpose. And having done that, we then took a view of what is happening in South Africa and tried to identify the key problems to be solved. And amongst the many problems to be solved, we said that a plan must help us to eliminate poverty and reduce inequality. And then we did, in June of 2011, we did a diagnostic that raised 9 big challenges in society. And we lifted 2 challenges as the most important as contributing to poverty and inequality. The first of those is that too few South Africans work, not because they're lazy, but because they can't find work. And the second problem is that the educational outcomes for the majority of black South Africans is suboptimal. And that there's a causal relationship between educational outcomes and the ability to find work. And then we raised 7 other challenges, and I won't go into that because I'm sure you're all very literate, you would be familiar with it. You can remind me of what these things are. We took those 9 challenges, built around the key objectives of eliminating poverty and reducing inequality. Note, eliminate and reduce, it's not the same because these are different things. And then we had very wide discussion across South Africa. We took it to all political parties, we took it to all legislatures, we took it to municipalities, we took it to universities for discussion, we sat in radio stations, we had an online discussion with 10,000 South Africans below the age of 30 in a discussion that lasted for 72 hours where the commissioners sat and we were dealing with questions online. We took a view of all of these things. And then we asked ourselves whether we'd missed anything in doing the diagnostic. And out of that consultation, people said that there were 4 areas that we should look at in a bit more detail. The first of those was community safety. What do we do with crime where we live? The second one is social security. What about people who can't find work? The third issue that was raised was, how do we see South Africa in Africa and the world? And the 4th area that we hadn't looked at the first time was, what about the rural areas? And so, on top of the 9 big thematic areas that we started with, we had to bring these 4 in, and so I'm saying that it's a systems approach that tries to answer not just how to deal with, how to eliminate poverty and reduce inequality, but tries to answer what is a decent standard of living. I know that there are some companies that are advertising how much is enough and then you lie on a yacht. That's not what this is about. This is about basic, decent standard of living that every South African should be entitled to. And if you look at this, I'm sorry, man, you can't see. Why don't you sit over there? It's okay. I won't feel offended and I won't feel lonely. It's okay. And it's not just about whether you have a job, it's also whether you have access to good, safe food. It's about whether you have housing, water, and sanitation. It's about whether you have cheap, efficient, reliable transport between where you live and where you work. It's about whether you have access to education and skills. It's about all of these things. And somehow, if we want to change society, then we need to know what we must focus on, and part of what we want to focus on would be the elements of what we describe as a decent standard of living for all South Africans. Excuse me. Again, I want to emphasize that, no, just give me that bottle. I want to emphasize that even if you've solved one of these problems, even if you've solved the problem of public transport and every South African has cheap, reliable transport between where they live and where they work, if you've solved that problem to 100% effectiveness and you haven't solved all of the other issues, you haven't really lifted the standard of living. And you can only deal with these issues if you have a systems thinking approach. It's about understanding lateralism, and it's about understanding the interconnectedness between issues. I'm saying I missed Dr. Dorstall's presentation yesterday, but that's where you need to go. And if you read through the NDP, and it's difficult because one of the problems that we have is that the way in which we work doesn't allow us to always do diagrams that look a bit like this. We look at chapters, and then we think chapter 1 is more important than chapter 15 in the National Development Plan. And we had big problems about these issues. You see, the last chapter of the NDP, for instance, is about social cohesion and nation building. Now, we had an intense discussion about this issue, very intense, because it's actually not a chapter. It doesn't stand alongside the need to deal with education and skills. It doesn't. It's not against that. In fact, the challenge of nation building and social cohesion should be the undergirding that holds all of these things up, because within it are issues that you can't measure, like trust. Without trust, you can't build. You can't build a nation, you can't build a sense of common purpose without trust. When people don't trust, they don't pay taxes. If government can't collect taxes, it can't provide these kinds of services. But at the same time, trust is not like a raincoat that you put on before you go outside into the rain. It's something that you build in practice, and so how you do this thing is fundamentally important. Now, the first provocation I want to make is about Parliament, because I want to leave some meat on the bone for you to think about in your groups today. You see, and Parliament is very linear. In the bottom right-hand corner, something I hope you can see. Do you see it there? Where's the laser pointer? That thing there. You see, the Germans have a word for it. They call it Kabelsalaten, a salad of cables. Kabelsalaten. Each cable is independent, and unless you are like this man here, who's very expert at it, you won't know where a cable starts and ends. And Parliament is a little bit like Kabelsalaten. You see, because you can arrive in Parliament, like some of us did in 1994. You don't know Parliament, you don't know anything about the rules or anything. And then they say, where do you want to sit? And you say, I think I want to sit on the Portfolio Committee of Foreign Affairs. Okay. Why do you want to sit there? I think I will travel if I sit there. Okay. Now, some of the people are there in the 5th Parliament. They're still sitting in the same Portfolio Committee. They haven't traveled, but they don't know of anything else that they might be able to do. And so when Dirko comes along with a white paper on foreign policy, they evaluate that policy. If you ask them based on their policy understanding of that, whether that ties into those terrible events in Yemen this week that saw the life of Mr. Korki lost, do they draw a connection? No, because they look at policy evaluation in their Portfolio Committee. They look at legislation in that Portfolio Committee, so don't ask them about the Mines Health and Safety Act, because that's not what they look at. They only look at this thing. And when there is a budget discussion, you know, they have to be dragged kicking and screaming too, because when Parliament sits and the sausage machine works and there are 6 extended public committees on a day, you go to the one where you are in the Portfolio Committee, and then the whoops must threaten you to get to the others, and you have no interest in what is happening there. So you don't even know whether in the ranking of priorities the foreign service should be more important than defense or more important than health. All that you know is You are there, you wear these oorklappies that they put on the horses and you march like this, you know, because that's what you are. When there's an annual report, you discuss that. You don't discuss anything else. And my provocation is that unless we fail to understand that, let me go back. Unless we understand the problem of Kabul Salatin, because there's one bit of cable there that runs, that's that foreign affairs cable, you see. Then there's another one that's basic education runs over there. Then higher education and training runs over there, and so on. Unless you understand that all of these things are interconnected, what are we actually doing? What problem are we trying to solve? Can we say, in all fairness, in good conscience, that when Parliament operates on that basis, that we respond to the mandate of Parliament that the Constitution gives it? To be the representative and the voice of the people, and to oversee executive action. Can we say that? Because if we can't, if we have any doubts in our minds about whether we can say that, then I think we've identified one of the problems that must be solved so that Parliament can be strengthened going forward. Now, I know I'm talking about the National Assembly, but I could apply the same information and use those, because you know, if you know Latin words, you must be very clever. Mutatis mutandis. I looked it up on Wikipedia. But if you can say mutatis mutandis, then you must know that if you are looking at the provincial legislature, you will find similar issues. It may be a bit more concentrated. You won't have foreign affairs, but you won't be looking at issues in a very significantly dissimilar way. I want to step off this and say the reminder is, of course, that in the National Development Plan we've taken what we think is a contribution to a systems thinking approach. And the very antithesis of that would be the very linear nature of parliamentary decisions. So we've taken government. Now, I want to say, now I'm in the clear. Now this has nothing to do with me anymore. I'm just an ordinary citizen. Look at me, I'm a pensioner, okay? So the stuff that follows from here, I've read about, but I haven't done, okay? So spare me this stuff. We've taken the National Development Plan, and you've all read the plan. You can recite it in your sleep, and converted it into a medium-term strategic framework. Now, bear in mind that what the National Development Plan does is it says, it takes a longer horizon. It says, by 2030, this should describe the kind of society we want to live in. And doing that itself was an interesting exercise, because many of the things we work with, many of the tools we have, are evidence-based. Economists look at the world, and they look at the world last year, and they look at the world the year before that, and the year before that, and they say, based on what we know about this trend, this is a likely outcome next year. And so most of decision-making, most of forward-looking is based on that kind of approach. But that doesn't solve your problems. So how do you get from where we are when we did the work 2011, 2012 to 2030? Because under democracy, it was much further to go than where we'd come from. So how do we deal with these kinds of issues? So we invited people who have different skills. We invited writers, people who work with imagination. They don't need numbers. We invited one of South Africa's, well, they're both South African novelists, Njabulo Ndebele and Anki Kroch, and said, help us, because we are the Planning Commission. And if you go to the front of the plan, under vision, you will find it's very beautifully written. It says, now we stand in 2030, and we look back at the road that we've traversed since 1994. And they then, from their imagination, describe the society that then exists, how people relate to each other, the access that people have, and so on and so on. Because part of problem solving is knowing that you need to bring in different skills. And so we did it in an interesting way. I don't know if other planning commissions do it like that, but that's what we did. And then we drew on the strengths and skills of what we know and tried to get to that point that's then described in the vision. But that's 2030. And so what the government has decided is to develop the medium-term strategic framework, and you'll see this MTSF is 2014 to 2019. And what the medium-term strategic framework does is it actually takes some of the commitments made in the National Development Plan and asks, where do we want to be in 2019? So this is not just writings of novelists. This is now bringing things together with hard facts. It sets very clear objectives. It says to Parliament, oversee where we want to be in 2019. But it also speaks to other things, because I have encountered, Chairperson, people who think that when you say that the National Development Plan talks about 2030, you will delay your decisions until 2029 so that you can get there in 2030. But part of what the medium-term strategic, the MTSF, does is it helps us front-load these things so that we understand if we make appropriate investments, for instance in education now, you will harvest the benefits of that. If you make appropriate investments in healthcare now, you will harvest the benefits of that. And so that's what the MTSF does, and it takes forward this approach, and I hope that I don't have to plow fields that have not been visited, because you would all have read the medium-term strategic framework. That's right, isn't it? Oh, they don't look so confident. They don't look so confident. Anyways, those who aren't confident are our visitors from other countries, neighboring states, and so on. The rest have read it, okay? So let me take a few examples from the medium-term strategic framework so you can see what this is about. And it's very important, Chair, that the Secretaries to Parliament understand these issues, because part of what needs to happen, and I'll explain in a moment why from the MTSF itself, is that Parliaments, the legislatures, must be involved in overseeing the performance of these targets. So the first example I want to take, and these, you know, the chapter is written exactly like this. If you've memorized the medium-term strategic framework, what I'm saying to you about basic education, quality basic education, you will remember is on page 16 of the document. Trust me. It's on page 16 of the document, and it says, it analyzes the problem, and the medium-term, the National Development Plan starts with this. What then has happened is that the departments have looked at it, and they've had to answer the Department of Performance Monitoring and Evaluation, which now also looks after national development planning, and say, by 2019, these are the things you must hold us to account for. And the first of those is that it wants to measure improvements in school governance leadership. Competence criteria must be established for teachers and principals, and management support for principals. Secondly, investment in school buildings and maintenance. They want to address backlogs and meet minimum standards, especially for issues like sanitation and ablution at schools. It says that it wants to support teacher development and improve training of future teachers. It wants to ensure that at least 95% of all learners in all grades have access to textbooks. It wants to strengthen the quality of grade R. It wants to undertake the further development of ECD, and it wants to introduce African languages to schools so that we all learn to speak a language other than English and Afrikaans. These are the commitments that they make. I didn't visit my former colleague, Minister Angie Motshekga, and get her to whisper this to me. This is published documentation. Page 16 of the MTSF. These are all very interesting, very important. You all know what ANAs are. Do you know what ANAs are? The annual national assessments. They were published last week. They're done at junior grades, grade 9, and then grade 9. And in grade 9, you see, because you must get a 50% pass. In grade 9, for this mathematics story, only about 10% of the learners who wrote got 50%. So 90% of those who wrote don't know half of the work in grade 9. That is a problem. You don't have to wait until these youngsters get to grade 12 to know that they're going to have a problem, that higher education is out, that probably FET is out, that the prospect of them finding jobs will be very greatly reduced. You don't need to wait until they get to grade 12. How do you solve the problem? Because remember systems thinking. These are the things that the department says they can do, and perhaps it's supporting teacher development. Or perhaps we must get better governance of schools. But you've got to know how to solve the problem, because the problem has been identified. I'll come back to this in a moment. The second example is a long and healthy life for all. There are some very hard numbers in there. We want to construct 213 clinics and community CHCs, my handwriting was bad, community health centers, construct 43 new hospitals, refurbish 870 health facilities in 11 pilot NHI, National Health Insurance areas. Double the training to 2,000 a year of doctors. Double the number of patients on antiretroviral treatment from 2.4 to 5.1 million. These are the numbers. Intensify TB screening and treatment, including 150,000 inmates of correctional facilities, 500,000 mine workers, and 600,000 people in mining communities. And vaccinate 90% of 9 to 10-year-old girls against the human papilloma virus. These are hard commitments. Are they the only commitments? Would this be adequate to help this country deal with a risk, say Ebola broke out? That's a question that must be answered somewhere. If you've trained all of those doctors and you don't have an adequate number of trained nurses, does that solve your problem? if you have doctors and nurses, but you don't have people who clean the hospitals properly, or provide good, solid, adequate nutrition to patients in hospitals, does that solve your health problem? On Saturday, I bumped into my good friend, the MEC for Health in Gauteng, Qaidani Mahlangu, and she said to me, my brother, there's so much trouble because I'm trying to run a health system when I have hospitals and clinics that don't have medication. And so we spoke about this because I know these things now because I'm fighting a bit of a cold today. If I needed Cepacol, I could go to, let's say I go to ShopRite Checkers, I could go to Messina and I will find it there. I can go to Bredasdorp and I'll find it there. I can go to the Bluff here and I'll find it. I can go to Alexander Bay and I'll find it throughout the country. And if they run out by tomorrow, there will be fresh Cepacol there. And how in a province like Gauteng, which is actually the most advanced part of the African continent, which is small and contained, you can't get medication to health facilities. It's an interesting problem. This conference is about problem solving, so let's put the problems on the table. This is what the health sector wants to do, what they've committed to in the MTSF now. Does the Secretary for the KZN Legislature know how many of these hospitals will be in KZN? How many community health centers? How many clinics? Where they are? Do we know these things? Because if we don't know them, we won't solve the problem. I think your work just got a lot more interesting and challenging. The third example, and I'm only going to take 3, okay? Because I can see you bored. Wake up, it's not so bad. I'm not going to be here all day. This comes from the community safety sector, and it's that commitment that's made that all people in South Africa aren't feel safe. There's a little test I do when I travel. I know by this afternoon when I arrive back at OR Tambo International Airport, as I walk through to get to the parking, there are all kinds of people who hang around. They are taxi drivers. They will say, hey, Brati, unjan. Oh, Mr. T, Brother Trevor. The taxi drivers know you. The guys who shine the shoes know you. There'll be 10 policemen standing there. And you can walk right through the middle of them, and it's as though their brains have been removed before they've been put in uniform. They don't know anybody. Now the MTSF on page 19, where it deals with we feel safe, says that there'll be a reduction in the number of reported crimes. What, are we going to be scared of the police and not report crimes? How are we going to reduce the number of reported crimes? It says that we will increase the proportion of citizens who feel safe walking alone. Are there volunteers? I can take you somewhere tonight. Let's have volunteers. I'll take you to Nyanga tonight in Cape Town. Let's get volunteers to walk alone. Not 2 by 2, just alone. Let's get the volunteers. And they'll have an increased proportion of citizens who feel satisfied with the police service. There'll be an improvement in how we feel about the levels of crime and an improvement in South Africa's ranking in Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index. Now, what I want to leave on the table for you to think about, and you can work your way through all of the examples in the medium-term strategic framework. I've just lifted 3. I've not gone to pick out the worst or the best. These 3 just happen to be the first 3, and I've taken them and said, all right, good example, but actually, is there a methodology? Go back Go back. Right. The education one, broad objectives. Is there measurement of anything? Education, health has measurements. Where would you know whether that is provided for? Will you check the budget? When in February, Minister Nana gets up and delivers the budget, and then the MECs for Finance deliver the budget, will you find these numbers in the budget? If not, it's not going to be delivered on. And in example 3 on crime, I mean, surely they must be a little bit more specific than what they, even just a little bit more specific would be okay. And there's a reason why. You see, because one of the things that this document, the medium-term strategic framework, says, it says that the implementation must be monitored. It says it's designed, the medium-term, I'm quoting here, the medium-term strategic framework is designed to enable cabinet, parliament, provincial legislators, and public to monitor overall impact. My mother used to warn me and say, don't trouble trouble till trouble troubles you. This second bullet here says, we are inviting you to monitor what we do. Take us at our word. That's what the medium-term strategic framework says. You've taken the NDP, you've taken it down to the first 5 years, you've broken this thing down, and then you say monitor. And it says the president will enter into performance agreements with each minister, and in that performance agreement, and this will be published on the web, the key indicators and performance measures would be there. And then it says, once you've got that, when the strategic plans come from departments into Parliament, watch out, because they must give you a lot more detail. Please make a note, it's on page 15 of the medium-term strategic framework. I didn't make this thing up on the plane. It's on page 15. This stuff is from there. I'm saying it's an invitation to an energetic Parliament. Now, you see, if you want the Parliament to be energetic, then we have to ask, how energetic? Pay back. No, that's not what I meant. Sorry. Let me be cruel. Let me be cruel and tell you something. If I could sing, but my voice is gone, you know, so I'm not even going to try, but Satchmo sang a song, there's so little time and so much to do, there's so little time for dreams to come true. You know that song? There's so little time and so much to do. Now, if we go back to the monitoring and evaluation of the medium-term strategic framework, which is what Parliament must do, because the Constitution says it must have oversight over executive actions, then it must have a lot of time to do that monitoring. So let me be cruel as I can be. You see, and so I've tried to look at what happens in Parliament. In January, Parliament's on vacation. In February, there's the SONA, the state of the province, the state of the village, there's that, and then there's budgets. In March, there's a first reading debate and a little bit of legislation. April is Easter, then we have a constituency period, which means Parliament doesn't sit. And May, when we come back, we're a little bit tired from Easter eggs and so on, and then we have departmental budget votes. And because we must get through them in a limited period of time, we have them 6 in parallel sessions. We are completely frenetic. We don't know what's going on. It's like a machine that's run out of control, like the turbine at Duva Power Station yesterday. It's like that because we think that we will have oversight over Parliament in this way, over the executive. And in June, that continues a little bit. Then we are really tired. Then we go Duga. And all of July, we are on constituency period. You know, in Margate, on the Wild Coast, planting in Iladli. You know, that's constituency period. We don't go to the constituency office. We're just not in Parliament. And then in August, we think, hey, you know, one of the things that the Constitution says that Parliament must do is pass legislation. Then we think, let's pass some pieces of legislation. But then September, you get the strategic plans coming through. This is what the department that we're overseeing in this very narrow way is going to do next year. We better try and understand what this thing is about. And then October, we also start to get the annual reports of departments. And then the Minister of Finance wants to do the medium-term budget policy statement and the adjustment estimates. And then we continue until November. Now we say, hey man, but there are many things we haven't done, which is why Parliament sits till midnight and they misbehave. Yeah? Parliamentarians behaving badly. That's at midnight because in all of the year, these things weren't done. And then everybody is really, really tired and must go home to prepare for Christmas and then the January holiday afterwards. That's a parliamentary cycle. Tell me I've made this up. Tell me I've made this up. I wish I could. I've also looked at how many weeks in the year Parliament has sat, and in the past 5 years, this is, now you're going to say we provincial legislatures, we are much better than this. I'll get to you in a moment. But in the past 5 years, the longest period that Parliament has ever sat is 27 weeks. 27 weeks. I go back to that song by Satchmo. There's so little time and so much to do. Whatever can you do in 27 weeks? And this year, because it was an election year, Parliament only sat for 19 weeks, including the period before the elections when the SONA and the budget were done, right up until the other day when the man I saw in the foyer outside, my good friend, Deputy Speaker Sinodi, I mean, even he'd run out of patience. Now you can imagine how difficult life is. I'll tell you the other part of the problem within Parliament. Because remember, my mandate is to find a way of ensuring that Parliament can oversee the National Development Plan, and in order to do that, I'm helping Parliament think about the things that it doesn't do. It's what we celebrate. You know, in February next year, the President will deliver the SONA, the State of the Nation address, one Wednesday evening. And everybody who comes there would have spent the past 3 weeks at the tailor and the dressmaker and the shoe shop, and you know, even if you are as hairy as I am, you get your hair done for the State of the Nation address. We celebrate the State of the Nation address. And once the President has spoken, we go to lavish dinners, and the same thing, mutatis mutandis, applies in the provinces. State of the Province address, the Premier, the army, the king, everybody dressed to the nines in uniforms. We march up and down. We feel very happy. Why? Because of the state of the province address. Don't tell me why that is, but that's what we do. I've done this thing before, so ask me. When the Minister of Finance gets up and delivers a budget speech, everybody's happy. And when there's a policy announcement by any minister, any MEC, everybody's happy. But all of this is just intent. It's a watch this space. But what we don't celebrate is how the money gets spent. Was the money spent as it was planned? What does the audit say about this department? When there is an adverse audit opinion, who gets called? How much publicity is there? Who gets new clothes for that hearing? Do we bring the army too much up and down when the audits are discussed? Why not? So you see, we measure intent, not performance, and that's what's wrong with our system. And who's at the center of this, chairperson? Who? Parliament. I'm provoking SALSA. They say, don't bring that man back. He came there, he provoked us, he made us angry, he made us feel bad. It's okay. As long as you fix the problem, it's okay. Don't worry about me. You see, part of what we don't do is to use the information available. There's a lot of evidence. You know, for 16 years, I looked after a department called Stats SA. The Statistician General is a man with a yellow suit. Very passionate about statistics. And you know, these are 3 screenshots, and each one of these, they're screenshots from my iPad. Each one of those would be some different series that Stats SA reports on. Government financial performance, transport performance, employment, quarterly labor force survey, GDP growth, October household survey, census. There are so many. There are 200 of these that they produce every year. Well, of course, you know they do GDP every quarter and so on. How many times are these things discussed in Parliament? Or in the provincial legislatures? How many times? Never. So how do we take decisions? How do we know where we are? What does the evidence tell us? Let me take something that Stats SA doesn't do, so that you don't think I'm partisan just because I worked with these people. Stats SA doesn't do crime stats. Now I showed you the third example, which is what the police say they're going to do, make us feel good. But when the crime stats comes up, I know that there were hearings just recently in Parliament. In the National Assembly there were hearings. Portfolio Committee on Safety and Security had the police, had IPID, the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, come and explain, and they have to explain how many times the police are involved in wrongdoing, what the investigations have proven. There's a lot of evidence, because I've seen the crime stats, they will say, which is why I said Nyanga earlier. Nyanga has the highest level of interpersonal crime in the country, followed by one part of Khayelitsha. All of this information is available, but Parliament doesn't use it. How can Parliament, and the same applies, because if you're in the Western Cape Legislature, or if you are looking at the KZN Legislature, and the information is that in Wentworth, there are lower instances of gangsterism. In Chatsworth, there are lower instances of drug abuse being reported. In Umlazi, there is now less talk of interpersonal violence. Do we discuss these things in Parliament? If not, why not? Don't they sit squarely within the mandate of what the Constitution says our legislatures must do about representing our people? So why don't we do these things? Madam Secretary, nobody, is it the whips who say, hey, why not, don't go there? Because this information is in the public domain, you know. But why don't we use the evidence? And I'll tell you why we don't use the evidence. Because we don't even know why the evidence is important. There's a philosopher, you know, and let me preface what I'm going to say. This is a joke, okay? It's a joke. Pretend that this is said by Trevor Noah, not Trevor Manuel, okay? Joke. There's a philosopher who was in the cartoons when we were growing up. He lived in Yellowstone National Park. His name was Yogi Bear. You remember Yogi Bear? You see, Yogi Bear said, if you don't know where you're going, you don't know when you lost. So we don't know how far off the mark of the MTSF we are because we don't actually know where we want to go. All that we want to do, if that third example is right, and want to feel good. I feel glad all over. That's all we want to do, but that doesn't deal with the problem of crime in society. So we don't know where we're going, so we'll never know that we lost because we don't want to use the evidence that is available to parliaments. And so my provocation to the Secretariat of the Greater Parliament here is, if you don't put these things under the noses of the legislators, how will they ever know it exists? And I don't want to suggest that you aren't doing it because of hard work, because I've also gone to look at a few other things. I'm terrible, you know, I'm terrible when I get going, so. I've gone to look at the parliamentary weekly schedule. Mutatis mutandis, the same applies to provincial legislatures. Mondays, constituency. No work. Family time. Tuesday mornings, the committees meet, and I say 9:30, but I've gone to check, most of them actually meet at 10 because they need traveling time to 1 o'clock. There are about 30 portfolio committees in the National Assembly. There's never been more than 26 that met on a Tuesday morning, and they meet from about 10 to 1. So call it 180 minutes, call it times 35,400 minutes of work in committees. Then there's lunch. In the afternoon, there might be a plenary, which is not very useful because there are things called member statements and notices without motion and motions without notice, and sometimes there might be 1 or 2 pieces of legislation, and that's it for a Tuesday. By 5 o'clock, people are very tired. And Wednesday mornings, committees meet, and this is a very intensive day. I mean, the highest number of committees I found that had ever met on a Wednesday is 29. I don't know where the 30th one is. And then Wednesday afternoons is question time, so you don't discuss what comes from the committees. So if you want to take these crime stats and so on, there's no place to talk about it on a Wednesday because, you know, you have to ask questions to ministers. And then on Thursday mornings is a programming meeting, which is the Secretaries of Parliament, the presiding officers, the WERPs, and so on. Then it's party caucuses till lunchtime, and then there's a little bit of plenary time in the afternoon till about 5 o'clock. But by 5 o'clock, if you are in the opposition, you must get Parliament to vote because the planes are full. People leave by 4 o'clock. And Friday is just TGIF, thank God it's Friday. The highest number of committees I'd ever, I went to check, I didn't make these things up, believe me. 6 committees met on a, and you know, I was traveling not so long ago from Cape Town, and I met a parliamentarian who I've known for a long time, and I said, but it's Saturday morning. No, it's Friday night. How come? He says, man, because Parliament had to meet today, you know. So I said, but my brother, it's Friday. He says, yeah, we won't let this stuff happen again. Now let me get your hackles up even a little bit more, because, you know, my job is to get you to sweat it out a bit. You had a good dinner last night. You've got to sweat it out this morning. Backbench member of the provincial legislature this year is on about 950,000, give or take. Backbench member of National Assembly, NCOP, just touching 1 million now. I'm not talking about whips. I'm not talking about secretaries. I'm not talking about presiding officers. I'm just talking about backbench MPs. You see, these ones who work so hard like this and like this, you see? These ones. This is R1 million a pop. Okay? But you see, because Parliament and the legislative sector also takes the responsibility of linking with the people very seriously. The parliamentary sector, over and above the salary bill, the national and provincial parliaments, between them spend 830 million rand a year on 860 members for outreach work, constituency offices and so on. Now call me a liar for 10 rand, but that looks to me like an additional 1 million rand per MP or MPL spent on outreach work a year. Call me a liar for 10 rand, but that's what the numbers will tell you. And so, because I didn't put in Saturday and Sunday, and Monday and Friday, because, and those constituency periods, the MPs must be in their constituencies, sitting in their offices, conducting clinics with their constituents, hearing them out, taking forward their issues into Parliament. Because remember, the Constitution and the strategic plan of the parliamentary system says we are the voice and representatives of the people. You've got to listen to the people. And in the breakdown, there's one MP or MPL for every 65,000 South Africans. I can do the numbers for you on how many hours Parliament sits and how many hours people are away from Parliament, but clearly 4 days a week. They're not in Cape Town. They are in their constituencies. That's apart from long constituency periods. And so if that system works, we shouldn't have to have a public protector or anybody else. We have the voice of the people right there. Have I made this stuff up? You bet I didn't. You've asked me to talk about whether Parliament can implement the National Development Plan. I'm saying to you that, or oversee the implementation of the National Development Plan. I'm saying that there's a clash of civilizations. The NDP is based on systems thinking. Parliament is based on linear thinking. The NDP needs a lot of work of implementation and oversight, and my observations are Parliament doesn't sit nearly enough. The President, when he set the National Development, the Planning Commission off, he said, I want you to take a deep, cross-sectoral and critical view. Bring the evidence and support your decisions, and we will have to see this through. And so the evidence is there, but the evidence is also available to Parliament. Part of what I'm saying here is Parliament doesn't use the evidence. So Parliament will never know where it's going, so it'll never know that it's lost. So, if I haven't made enough trouble, I know you want to ask me questions, but I'm going to do the asking of questions today. And the first question is whether our legislators are equipped to supervise the implementation of the National Development Plan and the Medium-Term Strategic Framework. Are they equipped? If not, how do we get them equipped? It's not by sending them to university first. How do we get them equipped? These are not the legislators we wished we had. These are what we have. It's all we've got right now. There's a great socialist poet, Bertolt Brecht, who said, the government has lost confidence in the people. The government seeks to appoint a new people. These are the MPs and MPRs we've got. No, not what we wished we had. This is what we've got. So how do we equip them to be able to deal with it? Because if we don't, then we don't live out the values of our Constitution. And if we think that it's happening because certain things are not right, how do we improve those things? And the last question is, how can secretaries as non-members of Parliament facilitate? Of course, you know, I came through 20 years as a minister without a lot of schooling, education, university education. I learned from close interaction with very competent public servants. Listening to them, debating with them, taking what they say, going back, reading up, arguing, the toss. But they shaped my thinking about a lot of issues. And so the minute the whip says, but you're the secretary, you shouldn't know about these things, you can tell them the story about what happens between public servants and ministers, because ministers are always briefed. They don't have original thought. Similarly, your job is to ensure that the parliamentary system is briefed. Parliamentarians don't wake up one morning and say, it's Monday, I'm going to go to Parliament. No, those things are set up by the secretaries. I know I was once leader of government business, and that Thursday morning meeting is important because the Secretary of Parliament must tell you what the prospective program for the week looks like, what the detail is, and so on and so on. So there's immense power that you possess. And if you want to see this country improved, and you want to see that our Constitution lived out, that we improve on the quality of life of all of our people and free the potential of each person, then you've got to wake up every morning and say, how are we going to do this in the legislature that I serve? And if you do that, Paul, we'll know that the NDP is being implemented. Thank you very much.